and almost good afternoon, and welcome to the second panel of Urban Arc today. Today's discussion is on constructing communities in the urban, and I'm very excited to say that we have quite a wide geographical range of Indian cities we'll be hearing from. There's Delhi, Ranchi, Ahmedabad, and Guwahati represented up here on the panel. And everyone's going to first speak about for 15 minutes each, and then we'll take questions at the end. But I just wanted to, introduce the panel by saying there are a few overlapping themes that I'm very interested to hear you all talk about. And one is what social and spatial marginalization does to community building and self-organization, not only around an identity politics, but also around basic infrastructure in the city. And the second, I think, common theme that we'll hear today is very kind of contemporary issue on human-machine relations and how technology in the way of digitalization or more physical infrastructure like CCTV cameras start to impact community building. So without holding anyone back from presenting, I'm just going to ask Jaismata to start.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jaismata Bhattacharya. I'm an architect, and I'm pursuing my master's in urban and regional planning from School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal. This is my first attempt to a paper presentation, so please pardon my mistakes. The topic that I wanted to study is the impact of digitalization on equity, creating inclusive urbanism. Digitalization, technology, social media as a whole is affecting everybody's life. There's nobody here in this room who does not use a social media app. But is it helping in creating a kind of environment for people that they feel that, yes, we are also part of the rest of the world, or is it creating a barrier like we call digital divide? So what is more? Is it helping in creating an inclusive theme for people or not? And the city that I'm going to talk about is Shillong, and I'll proceed further. So we know that urbanization is going at a very fast rate, and in about 3 decades' time, we'll be nearing almost 70% of the population. 70% of the population will be in urban areas. So what does this mean for the cities? We have seen the trend that the urban population, when the urban population rises, inequality also rises, right? Here we can see what a city is. Well, a city is made up of many, many different actors. Everything, right from a criminal to a policeman, from kids to old people, from a laborer to a white collar person. It's diverse. It's just a place for economic hub. It attracts people because you can share your ideas. Like, for example, Bangalore, it is attracting people because you can come up with startups here. So cities is such a beautiful invention, where people come with a hope to improve their life for better opportunities. So it is all these complexities of a city that gives the identity of a city, of what makes a city, right? And it is that life in a city that is called as urbanism. Here, so again, a city is a man's greatest invention, and urbanism is a way of life. Now, urbanism, a very complex topic. A lot of people have tried to explain it. We couldn't, because so many different people live in a city. So to me, it's something else. To you, it can be something else. Like, we can see the image of Mumbai, photograph taken by Johnny Miller, who tried to capture the unequal scenes. So you can see the slums, and you can see the high-rise there. So for us, the slums of Dharavi, we can call it slum urbanism. But for the people who are living there, they might call it an adaptive urbanism, because they are living with whatever they can make of, right? So how do you define an urbanism of a city, or in particular Indian urbanism, because it's so complex? Some say that society, culture, economy, with the interaction with technology today in the contemporary world, this is what makes an urbanism. Some say urbanism is transient because it's just changing, it's superficial, it's anonymous because there's so many people, or it depends from person to person, individualism. So every individual has a different impact on the city and themselves, and every city has a different tale to tell about the city. So basically, among So this is what a city is, just the different fabrics that weave the city together, the different tales, the different people that come together. That is what an Indian urbanism is, perhaps, or somebody might come up with a better definition. Uh, so, yes, here we talk about digitalizing. Okay, so urbanism, so many different types of urbanism. Can we come up with, talk about one urbanism where people feel included to, I mean, because one entity that everybody can use irrespective of their social backgrounds, their economic background? Is there one entity that everybody living in a city or in a rural area can identify themselves with or are using right now to create their, to improve their lives better? And that is what I thought was technology, digitalization, everything that we have in the palm of our hands. So everybody who has an access to a phone or a gadget or Wi-Fi is using it, and it is impacting their life some way or the other. So in 2002 is considered to be the digital age, and Government of India also started came up with the programs like Digital India, that is power to empower. What everybody, all of us sitting in this room must use all the logos that's mentioned here, like that's given here. Everybody uses that, more or less, in day-to-day life. So what is this digitalization actually doing? It's giving us a digital platform to share ideas. Right now, the wave that is going off of uprising that is going on all over India, you know, India against cab or India for cab for some people. We just had hashtag Priyanka Reddy. Everybody from all around India is creating a pressure on social media to take some action. They are fighting for or against whatever they believe in, which did not happen like 20 years back or 10 years back, perhaps. So isn't this creating an inclusive community, an inclusive environment where everybody can share their idea? Let's talk about the LGBT community. Until like 10 years back, how many people would come up, would accept themselves for what they are? But right now, because they see somebody else, an influencer or somebody who has gone through the same struggles in some different part of the country, different part of the world, and they think that, oh, I'm not the only one, there are other people like me. And so digital media, digital platform is giving people a chance to accept themselves. Once they accept themselves, to show people, you know, to unite, to make others believe in their ideas, at least to share their ideas with others. So in many, many ways, digitalization is helping, or digital library or distant learning, working from home, everything or the other creates an impact on somebody. Working from home for a mother with a baby who cannot go to office is sitting at home and working now. So does not have to lose on one day of work. This is equity or equality in some sort of a way, isn't it? Money making, money sharing, services, shopping, everything is creating some impact on people. So digitalization has empowered masses and widened the reach of civil society. This slide basically talks about how society, economy, and governance all have been affected in a good way, sometimes in a bad way, but mostly in a good way by digitalization. We'll just quickly go through the downsides of digitalization, that is digital divide, right? So what happens in digital divide? There are various reasons because of which there are people in various parts of the country who cannot access the infrastructure that gives you access to technology. So you have social divide. I mean, 1 of 5 women have a phone all around India, whereas 3 of 5 men have a phone all around India. The illiteracy rate, the digital illiteracy rate, is huge. The geographical divide, the urban-rural divide, cultural attitude problem that, no, we don't want to use this thing. There's a lot of divide that exists right now, but I think the progress that technology has made in 10 years to 20 years time, this divide can be lessened. Like I mean, the progress of lessening the divide is really fast. However, the other downsides of digitalization is the data security and privacy concern, or the relative anonymity in internet, which leads to you know, online scamming or trolling or bullying. there are negative impacts of it, however. So I wanted to study Shillong and to find out if digitalization in Shillong is helping create an inclusive environment. Why? Because Shillong, as you can see in the little dot there, that is the map of Meghalaya within the map of India, it is at the most extreme corner of India. A lot of Indians don't know where Shillong is, in fact. In Shillong, Shillong falls in the 6th scheduled state. That is 97% of Meghalaya comes under Autonomous District Council. It's just 3% of the state which has a municipal corporation working in it. So once you have the 6th schedule working, that means the indigenous tribes, they have a higher power over the governance, right? So the disparities in Shillong is that this area that is showing here is the Shillong agglomeration area. And then we have a little area, a small area with wards. Within that, we have European ward. European ward is the only area which has been given to non-tribals so that they can come up with their businesses, provided that helps the tribals. Other than that, no non-tribal can own a land in Shillong. Businesses are shutting down. They are not letting people open their businesses. Even in education, we have Northeastern Hill University, NEHU, and no matter how good your marks are, a non-tribal will not be given preference. It's first the tribals and then the non-tribals. So there is a huge inequality going on in Shillong within the tribals and the non-tribals. So I wanted to study Shillong to see how the tribals feel included with the non-tribals of India or the rest of India or the rest of the world, how the non-tribals feel connected to the tribals in Shillong. And is the LGBT community, are they getting any help because of digitalization, entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs there, and the economically backward classes? So I sent questionnaires in the form of Google Forms. Why Google Forms? Because first of all, it's a digital platform. So I wanted to see how many replies I get. So I sent across as many as I could. Categories, I had 15 to 22, one category 23 to 40, and 41 and above. And I classified them on the basis of their family, annual family income, gender, tribals, non-tribals. And I had focus group discussion with people in the third category people, primary survey of entrepreneurs. I sent direct messages or had tried to have a contact with as many members of the LGBT community, and a focus group discussion with children from the Punjabi sweeper community of Shillong, which created the most impact in my study. However, findings in short, almost 90% of people in all three categories thought that yes, digitalization is helping them feel included in the society. However, some of them said maybe it is, maybe it's not, and some people said no. Very few said no. I'll move on from here are just the data of how many people use what apps. So I'll just move forward. This is a transcript that I held. So from FGD in the Punjabi sweeper colony, and this is what the kids told me, that it is helping them because a person using an iPhone and a person using the cheapest smartphone can access the same platforms on their phone, provided they get Wi-Fi. So they feel a part of the world. They feel, this person can use Instagram, I can use Instagram too. So that is what is making them feel like a part of the world. That divide does not fall there. These kids, they told me that in school, the tribal kids will not talk to them because they are a Dalit community. They don't go to a very good school. People don't talk to them. So in schools or whoever, the Khasis or even the other non-tribals would not talk to them. However, in Facebook, the same people are liking their photos. So this is creating, it's just a wonderful experience for them. Like, they don't talk to me, but at least they like me. So maybe they acknowledge my existence. They told me that even in those communities, people pay bills with the help of Paytm and Google Pay, which is an advancement. And they said that technology can't change the reality, but it creates a good illusion. And this came out from these words came out from a child, I know it's not helping in making our situation better, but at least it makes me feel better, technology. So when a child can use these words, that shows that they understand the importance of technology. FGD with senior citizens, they said, well, few of them said that I don't understand it and I don't want to use it ever because old people. There are some people who also said that, the last one, that inequality of Shillong cannot be helped by digitalization, but technology is definitely making their life easier. But the problem here is entirely different. So that is true. The problem is of governance, the problem is of the indigenous tribes, the problem is of they don't want their land to be shared with people. That is the problem. Digitalization may or may not help solve that kind of, that grave of a problem of inequality, but at least it's making life simpler, and it is helping, I mean, it is creating a mindset that we are accepted. And the response from LGBT community, they said that social media did not give them acceptance. It just gave them a platform for self-acceptance, a power that no other platform could give them. And like I said before, they have found people who have gone through the same struggles and have won their battles, and that gives them faith. And you know, we have a community not only in Shillong but all around the world. So a person in Shillong have a WhatsApp group with people from different around India, and they talk about their issues, and they have formed a friendship, that particular community. And it also comes with repercussions, because people shame the members of LGBT community in social media, which makes a lot of people shut themselves off from social media, from Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. So yes, digitalization comes with its pros and cons, but here what I wanted to say was that the advantages is way more than the disadvantages, and only if we can channelize these advantages, we can perhaps I mean, that is my way forward to find out how digitalization can be made more inclusive for urban and rural citizens. Right now, it was just to find out if it is helping, and the next would be, if yes, then how can we benefit more from this process? Thank you.
Hello. Hi. So my name is Bhargav, and I am an MPhil scholar with CEPT University, and I thank this institute for providing me with this opportunity and like to present my work here. I'm grateful to IHS. And the topic is rebuilding Juhapura, role of civil society, community leadership and self-development initiatives in rebuilding a ghetto. So this is a background and some kind of foundation work that lays down my MPhil proposal. So this is the background to my MPhil work, and I am looking for comments and feedbacks from all of you for this. These are some of the key concepts that I will be touching upon throughout the presentation, and these are like urban segregation and ghettoization, aspects of cities' political history, state-led development versus self-help, political economy of the state, ethnography. So firstly, I want to distinguish here between urban segregation and ghettoization. So urban segregation, and I'm specifically talking about caste and religious based segregation, wherein there is a spatial and a social and economic marginalization of a set of communities, but this is not necessarily a ghetto, because you can have like 5 different housing societies with 5 different castes, but there might be like public spaces, there might be parks, there might be gardens, there might be places of religious worship where people are interacting with each other, where they are talking, like there's intercaste exchanges, all of this is happening. But a ghetto is like a very exclusive neighborhood wherein like one ethnic community or a caste community is relegated to. So yeah, going forward. The research question is, has ghettoization led to some form of progress and development for Muslims in Juhapura? Juhapura is a Muslim ghetto in Ahmedabad, and I'll be talking about this. And if so, what is the nature of such development? And the framework, the conceptual framework that I'm using is political economy of state, where there is a state, where there's like a local state, a state government, a national government, there's a civil society wherein there are like different trusts, there are unions, there are organizations, all of this are acting, there's citizens also, there are like laborers, there are migrant workers, domestic help, all sorts of citizens residing in a ghetto. And then there are organizations, there are like various kinds of trust, institutes, etc., the development agencies. talking about the research tool and methodology that I've used, it's a qualitative research, and I've used ethnography. There have been like semi-structured interviews of 30 people spread across different parts of Juhapura and from different locations of class and other aspects. And these are, I want to make a distinguishment here that these are interviews of actors who have some sort of influence in the society, in the sense that these are very well connected individuals. They are either philanthropists, they are either NGO workers, they are lawyers, or they are professionals, or they are politicians, journalists, etc. I've also tried to get a grasp of what is actually happening on the ground by informally interacting with people and doing some observation analysis. And there are like limitations of this study, which I'll come to at a later point. Just to give a very broad sort of background of the city, I think I won't go very far back, but I just want to say that, so 19th century industrialization led the growth of Ahmedabad as a city, and then the Gandhian movement, the freedom struggle, the Gandhian institutions were there in the place. So that sort of led the growth of the city in some sense. And because of the Gandhian movement, you see that the labor and the capital, the relationship between them was like always proximate, and it was always like harmonious. There were no rebellions, or there were no like very big protests that you see in Maharashtra or in Bombay or other cities. And therefore it's known as Gandhi's Karma Bhumi. And the interesting part is that like this labor capital relations cut across class, gender, and religion. So you see that in the polls and in the chalis, you have exclusive caste polls, but they are still living proximate to each other, and they are like interacting on the streets, they are mingling with each other, all these things are happening. And so this was like the nature of the old city and the composite living spaces which was going on here. And this is where like the early urbanization of Ahmedabad started. But as the western city grew, and this was after the independence in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you see that there were like neighborhoods exclusively of certain castes. So you will find, for instance, Navrangpura, which is like an exclusive Brahmin or Jain communities residing, or there are like Chandkheda and Rani, which are like exclusive Dalit communities. There are like Patel colonies, and of course then there is Juhapura and other Muslim neighborhoods. This also coincided with the rise of Hindutva, and then like Gujarat and Ahmedabad is known as the laboratory, and the global city remaking and neoliberal projects, as like someone mentioned in the yesterday's presentation, is also going on. So that's a broad frame of Ahmedabad. And this is the map of Ahmedabad, and the dark areas show the Muslim dominated localities. And so this is Juhapura, this is Fatehwadi, this is Ramul, this is Vatwa, this is the old city, and this is Rakhyal and Bapu Nagar. And this I have taken from the Shini Mahadeviya's paper. And so now the way I will be taking this forward is like I'll first talk about how state exclusion is not just notional, but is real. And then I'll be talking about what people are actually doing, like as forms of self-help and self-development. So there's Disturbed Areas Act 1991, which was introduced during the Congress government, wherein which was initially implemented to stop the distress sale that was happening and the gentrification that was happening. But then once the BJP government came, like it got extended and it got expanded. So now the Disturbed Areas Act is also there in other cities, Rajkot, Vadodara, Anand, etc. And then it's also been extended every 5 years. And the earlier settlements in Juhapura started in 1973, where the Sabarmati riot, Sabarmati flood victims were resettled to. But there was the TP scheme only recently got finalized, which was like 5 or 6 months back. also, the ULB's core discretionary and obligatory functions as listed in 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, which is like road construction, drainage, water supply, housing, parks and gardens, fire safety, etc. Most of these are not present. There is a highway that connects Juhapura with Sarkhej, where you can see some sort of services connectivity happening, but not in the interior areas of Juhapura. And there is such a committee report, which is like a national report, which says that there is a lack of representation of Muslims compared to other religious groups in areas of education, employment opportunities, representation in the government, etc. So this is the marginalization is also happening because of political non-representation. So if you see the ward councillors, all the ward councillors are from Congress, and there are like 4 ward councillors in every ward, and this is after the delimitation. The delimitation was implemented in 2008. So this is after the 2008. Before this, the area was under ODA's administration. But if you see the Vidhan Sabha constituency and the Parliament, the Lok Sabha constituency is being represented by BJP since before 2008. It's continuing after 2008, but even before that, it was represented by BJP. And then coming to the background of Juhapura, as I said, the first settlements started in 1970s, and in 90s again after the so interesting thing is that after 60s, every 10 years Ahmedabad has seen riots. So in 70s and 90s, the first and second wave of migration happened to Juhapura, and Muslims settled there because of fear and insecurity of political violence. Post 2002, there has been ghettoization, there has been intensification, and there has been self-help initiatives that some scholars have talked about. The point that I want to emphasize here is that Juhapura is an unnatural space because it is characterized by one set of a homogeneous ethnic community, but within that ethnic community, you have diversity of class. So it is ethnically homogeneous, but there is a diversity within class, and also there is restriction on mobility. There's neglect by the state, and I'll be talking about this. And there's also presence of what Louis Vacon says is a web of group-specific institution. So he says that it's called institutional parallelism, which refers to a web of group-specific institutions which act like parallel government in a ghetto. One of the primary arguments in this paper is that the community-led groups, trusts, non-profit organizations, citizen groups, civil society representatives come into the picture and have their own networks through which negotiations with the state as well as delivery of services are undertaken. This is the area that I'm talking about, and it's located 8 kilometers from the southwest of Ahmedabad. Change of hands in governance from ODA to AMC. It's a very diverse area. This is the Sarkhej area. I'm not talking about these areas because these are like mixed localities to a great extent. But this is Juhapura. This is Fatehwadi area. This is Juhapura extension. This is Ehsan Park, and this is Maktampura. And this is like a very diverse spatial and demographic area because you have people across different income groups, different sects, but also there's like different landscape, there's like different forms of housing and constructions, etc. And then the stories of Juhapura have been like well captured by a lot of journalists. I'll very briefly talk about like the findings from the field work. And currently there are, I'll just be speaking about some 4 or 5 major areas like education, public health, livelihoods, social work, etc. And so There are like 30 to 35 schools providing primary and higher secondary education in Johapura. All of these are providing single medium or double medium education. These are schools that are like Modern English School, FD School, National English School, NK Girls School, Crescent School, etc., to name a few. And these are mostly private trusts. It is run by the zakat money, which is like a 2% income that every Muslim has to give for the community service. There's an RTE activism that has gone since 2007, and there have been like RTE activists spreading awareness about education, doing documentation for a lot of students, providing aid, providing uniforms, providing fees, etc. But at the same time, there is no college or there is no higher learning institute in Johapura, so a lot of students drop out after standard 12th, and these are like 100% enrollment of Muslim students. Only one government school which has come up very recently in Johapura. In terms of health, there are only 3 multi-care hospitals which has capacity of 150 beds. Again, these are private-run charitable institutions. There are no PHCs or CHCs in the area, and there is like severe lack of primary and secondary levels of care and treatment. Talking about physical infrastructure, the housing typology mainly consists of private housing societies and apartments in the Maktampura and Chhuapura area, but there are like clusters and single units. So Fatehpuri Canal area is the most impoverished area, and it's the most recent area. It has like migrant Muslims coming from other states, not from Gujarat, coming and settling there. And you see there is like some sort of ghetto forming within the ghetto. And there is self-provisioning of water through bore wells and tankers happening mostly in the Fatehwadi canal area, and there is always an eviction and demolition threat which is looming. Social work and activism, there's a rights-based approach and there's a services-based approach. So there are activists who talk about the constitutional language, about claiming the rights and entitlements, and then there are like organizations which focused on getting services delivery first rather than rights. And then there are programmatic interventions by a lot of organization, and you see there is also an aspirational economy which is being formed in Chhuapura, and like youngsters are they are doing a lot of community work, social work, but there is like also an aspirational economy which is present here. And there are like other forms of livelihoods, the dhabas, provision stores, the garage owners, garment shops, etc. Just to rush through the very pointed observations throughout my field work, there is a turnaround in primary education, activism, entrepreneurship, and these are like post-riots. These are developments post-riots, so we need to understand it from that frame. And there is a language of secularization and constitutionalism, which is very political and which is very conscious. And there is negligence, and while there is a negligence in provisioning of infrastructure by the state, there is a community-led effort, but this is never going to replace what can be done by the state because of finance, because of other factors that the state has, the resources that state has. So we shouldn't, like, I'm not trying to romanticize the self-help aspect of Johapura. And there is consequences of living in a ghetto. What is happening is that there is no exchange between the Muslim kids and the Hindu kids. There is like zero exchange. So it's like what Darshini calls is there are like 2 cities within one city. There's a Hindu city and there's a Muslim city existing in Ahmedabad. So there is an internal process and there is an external process. So both of this has like dark side to it. The internal process has like, of course, there's like this private trust and self-help models. They're like social and cultural capital that these civil society actors have built up. There's risk and vulnerability at the bottommost, the migrant workers who are working in Fatehwadi Canal area. there's elite capture of resources also happening, and there is something called Muslim Mahal, which Nida Kirmani talks about in her paper, where she says that there is an atmosphere of Muslimness across the area, and she is talking about in context of Delhi and Zakya Nagar. But she has also said that this is also very local. This is also like very experiential, like from person to person. And there's like external processes like tools, as I said, the tools of state exclusion, the Disturbed Areas Act, the town planning scheme, the local body not performing its functions, and the relationship of ghetto with the other neighborhoods in Ahmedabad being curtailed or restricted. So just to make a final point, I'm trying to say that we need to see self-help not as isolatory instances of happening in education or health, but we need to understand it as a process. So whatever the scholarship has been written on self-help, try to take the reference point of 2002 and try to say that this is happening in response of the riots. But it has been now 15 to 18 years after riots, and there have been like processes which are more complicated, and there is like an aspirational economy happening, but there is also exploitation happening. So like where do we see all of this? At the same time, I want to say that this self-help is a feature of the ghetto. So it is self-help happens in other neighborhoods and other localities also, but you don't see the kind of state exclusion happening there compared to Juapura. So that's, I think I'll end with that.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? So I'm a PhD student in anthropology at Princeton University, and that was actually a really great background to my paper. So my paper is more of a micro study of the lived experience of insecurity in a Muslim area of Delhi. Delhi's working class Muslim neighborhoods are marked by an absence of the state. Even when compared to their Hindu counterparts, these areas are found severely lacking in basic infrastructure, such as paved roads, running water, and police presence. As a result, residents have to improvise their own infrastructure. For example, they might pool money to pave their own roads or organize an informal network of accessible clean water. Recently, Muslims entering the lower middle class have also decided to take the issue of safety into their own hands by installing their own CCTV cameras outside their homes, and that's what I want to talk about today. So this paper draws on 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork in 3 low-income Muslim areas of Delhi. And what I want to try to do with this paper is depict urban life at the fringes of the state through the story of one family and one CCTV camera. So it's going to be very micro. This family was one of the first families in their neighborhood to buy a CCTV camera. So I'll use an ethnographic story to look at basically one question, which is what happens when historically segregated communities take matters of public safety into their own hands. This is just an ad for CCTV camera installation in a Muslim area of Delhi. I found that stories of women running off with their lovers, children disrespecting their parents, young men taking drugs, and stories of violent rapes were all seen as signs of the Mahal gone terribly wrong and circulated constantly. It seems as if the surge in the purchase of private CCTV cameras in lower middle-class Muslim areas of Delhi runs parallel to these accounts of rampant crime and moral degradation. I interviewed a CCTV camera vendor who primarily catered to Muslim neighborhoods, who told me that the craze for cameras began about 7 years ago in Delhi. Though most of his clients were Muslims who had recently entered the middle class, he proudly told me that he could install a camera in even the most narrow alley, meaning that he catered to poorer, more congested neighborhoods as well. According to him, one of the reasons for the increase in the purchase of these cameras had been a spike in crime over the last few years due to unemployment. He also cited several cases of women who lived alone, for whom the CCTV camera was a kind of stand-in for a male guardian. Another man who ran an Islamic school for young women in a Muslim area of Delhi told me that his dream was for his NGO to hand out free CCTV cameras to everyone in the neighborhood. This sentiment, this idea of sort of public surveillance being a public good, has been echoed, as you probably know, by many politicians in India, including the Chief Minister of Delhi, Arvind Kejriwal, whose main campaign promise was to install CCTV cameras for free in all of Delhi. This is an example of a CCTV camera. Main bustling square in which Zoya's mother, Ami, owned a general store. Their home served as a kind of village watering hole for the square. Migrant laborers who hawked vegetables and fruits would stop by the house and exchange the latest neighborhood gossip. In August of 2017, Zoya's family installed a CCTV camera in the outside of their home. They did this because in August, Zoya's brother Abdul had been attacked by one of the estranged brothers as part of this ongoing family feud. Though he had lodged an FIR, there was a general consensus that the police were pretty useless in Zayed-Nagar. And so in lieu of a capable police force, the family decided to install this CCTV camera, which they monitored from the back room of their home. According to the family, the justification behind the purchase of the camera was entirely for their own personal benefit, to protect themselves from these estranged brothers. Abdul, Zoya's brother, said, "If someone gets attacked again, at least next time we'll have evidence to show to the police." A few months later, though, Abdul told me that an unexpected byproduct of the camera had been a decrease in crime in general in the square outside of their home, which had become before rather notorious for petty thefts. He told me proudly, "Ever since the camera was installed, crime in the area has gone down." Over time, stories of small crimes that had been solved thanks to the camera multiplied. One time, Zoya's mother had fallen asleep in her store, and the local juice vendor snuck in and tried to steal some money. Zoya and her sister-in-law spotted him immediately on the monitor inside the house and had one of the brothers go out and handle him, meaning beat him up. Another time, a little boy had tried to steal some eggs from a shop in the square, and the camera had caught it all. Usually, the culprits were, again, handled in an informal way the police were never brought into these interactions. The camera proved to have another unintended use for the women of the family who rarely left the home. For them, it became a kind of safe window from which they could watch the world outside. When they were deciding what vegetables to buy for dinner, they would sometimes peruse the daily offerings of the vendors through the camera. Other times, they would spot people in the square and muse about their activities. When someone they were trying to avoid appeared on the screen, they knew not to go outside. When the screen suddenly went white in July, they knew that the municipal government was spraying anti-mosquito spray through the neighborhood. One day in June, I came to the house to find the family in a state of great excitement. Abdul greeted me at the door and said to me excitedly, "Guess what happened? A thief came and stole the neighborhood's transformer. He took it apart and walked away with the pieces. All of Zayed-Nagar was without electricity for the whole night." Abdul said that they had caught the thief on camera. He grabbed the CCTV mouse and rewinded through the last 24 hours of the camera's footage. He pointed out a man in a backpack with a cap who had been caught at 2:30 p.m. the day before. Suddenly, another brother burst in. He said that the same thief had just passed through the square. They rewound the camera and located the same man. Later, they showed the footage to the electricity people. Over the months, I realized that there was another, more important function to the camera, which was not necessarily as an instrument of surveillance, but as a kind of way to restore the family's reputation. According to Zoya's sister-in-law, Salma, one of the main motivations behind getting the camera had been to restore their reputation by proving to their neighbors that they were not at fault in the family feud. She told me, if another attack happens, we will have evidence that we didn't start the fight. So this was less about the police and less about surveillance. And the camera was much more useful sort of as a symbol of a third-party bureaucratic kind of impartiality than as an actual instrument of surveillance. And sort of to conclude, another interesting issue here is that no matter how much these private CCTV cameras are installed and may symbolize a kind of transparency, I found that they could never really compete with the sort of human surveillance networks that were going on in these neighborhoods. So in parallel to having the camera, I found that this family, for example, would constantly be telling me about couples that they had spotted meeting in secret, and my own activities were, of course, constantly surveyed. So in a way, these cameras were sometimes a bit redundant, given the already active surveillance networks. And neighborhoods like Zayed Nagar, their sort of spatial makeup was quite, there was a lot of narrow alleyways where sort of cameras can't really get a good angle. So the same conditions that maybe made it hard to install CCTV cameras made it easier, or sort of enabled this active neighborhood watch system where everyone was so close to each other that they could keep eyes on each other. So in conclusion, how might we expand this micro study? So I've tried to show in this paper that that these kinds of cameras can be used in ways that we might not expect. So in this case, it was used as a community surveillance tool. It was used as a source of entertainment. It was used as a window to the outside world, and it was used as a kind of symbol of impartiality. And so in lieu of so many sort of politicians in India promising CCTV cameras everywhere and sort of promising that this will ensure especially women's safety, I think it's important to do these more in-depth studies to see how these cameras are really being used, and also sort of look at the lived experience of insecurity in Muslim neighborhoods in India. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Brishti, and basically we are here to represent Yuva's work, and Yuva is a non-profit organization, and I'm currently working as an associate with Yuva. And this is not a study really. This is actually we are sharing the experiences of women unions, and the paper is about their experiences. It's their work, and just I'm just going to share how we've supported and also seen them grow from a union to a federation, and how they've been able to influence different stakeholders. So okay, so just setting the context. We are aware that the informal sector in India plays a mammoth role, and over the period of time there is a growing trend of informalization of the economy. And with time we've also seen that there is less and less number of regular workers now in the country, and along with that we've seen that when we're talking about activity in terms of in the informal, it's not always happening in the say in the industry or in the factory. There's also a lot of activity happening in the streets, on the pavements, and that is where we are going to kind of look into the whole the informal street vending in the informal economy. So, street vendors account for about 2 to 5% of the population of a metropolis in India, and the number of street vendors, the figures are very different and there is no accurate figure per se, but in this paper, since we are focusing on women vendors, it is said that around 200,000 women are engaged in street vending in the country. This is again subjected to variations. So before we go into the detail, it's important to understand that India has passed the the Street Vendors Protection of Livelihood and Regulation of Street Vending Act in 2014, and the onus is on the states to implement this particular act through passing the rules and the schemes. And we'll see how, in the context of Jharkhand, what is the status of the scheme, of the act. So methodology as already expressed before, that it's like Yuva's association specifically with the federation, with the National Hawkers Federation and with the unions, and the narratives from women leaders, women activists, and also the vendors themselves. So we see that one of the reasons that women choose street vending, the most common reason is you know. Financial pressure or situation back at home when they're really pressed to come out of their house and start something. And street vending is something that involves low capital investment, low skill, and there's a lot of autonomy that women enjoy when they have something, what you call a self-employed sort of profession. And when we're looking at women in the women as street vendors, they taking India specifically into account, we've seen that women do not really have social protection. They are very vulnerable when they are vending in the streets, in the sense that they don't have access to, say, toilets, or say creche facilities for their children, or for childcare, or say no access to breastfeeding. So it's like an open sort of a pavement area, and it's even more difficult for, say, women who are mobile vendors. So they are also prone to a lot of public health sort of issues, like, say, for example, acidity problem, high blood pressure, and other safety issues, security issues at the same time. And they're also, their property is also prone to crime and theft, because it's not possible for them to every time take their sort of what they're vending, the articles with them. So they leave it out in the open. They just cover it with say a tarpaulin or something, and many a times it is seen that it disappears. Some of the articles are missing. And at the same time, vending in itself, like street vendors in itself, they are looked down upon as, like, say, unsocial elements, and something, some sort of elements who are, say, causing traffic and blocking the roads and things like that. So social security is definitely one thing that's missing, and every day they are struggling for survival, and their profession is associated with multiple risks and shocks that they have to see and encounter every day. Okay, so I'm going to specifically focus on Ranchi. Ranchi is again located in Jharkhand, which is towards the eastern part of India, and that's like a detailed map of the Ranchi city. So again, Ranchi is not one of the typical metropolis, and the narratives specifically from Ranchi is not very mainstream. Like when we generally talk about cities in India, it's always been like Delhi, Bombay, Chennai, and Ranchi is something, I think, it's a smaller city, but it will be interesting to look at the kind of sort of unionizing happening in Ranchi. So that was one of the reason of kind of focusing on Ranchi as well. Just to give you a brief account of the geography. Jharkhand separated from Bihar in the year 2000, and Jharkhand also has a large portion, like around 67 percentage of people who depend on informal, who are engaged in the informal sector. And there is Jharkhand also has a lot of intra-state migration that's visible in Jharkhand, and specifically among women. It's it's around 79% as per the NSSO data. And with increasing urbanization and industrialization, and specifically the fact that Jharkhand is also a mineral-rich city, so there's a lot of mining activity and development-related projects happening. So a lot of people are displaced. That's one reason, and another one is also coming to the cities in search of better livelihood options. So we don't really have like sort of a set data on the number of street vendors in Jharkhand, but National Hawkers Federation, with whom like Yuva works very closely, they have kind of estimated that around 25,000 street vendors across 40 markets are present in Ranchi, and most of them happen to be women. Now the prominent street markets in Ranchi are like Lalpur Bazaar, there is Birsa Chowk, Nagababa Khatal, Ratu Road, and Nepal House, and they mostly constitute of women vendors who sell, say, vegetables, fruits, and fish. These are the common articles that they sell. Now these women are mostly tribal women migrating from the peripheral regions of Ranchi, like say Thakurgaon, Ramgarh, Gumla, Nagdi, and other districts, and they come to the city and just to kind of earn some living, and most of them are also single mothers. Some of them vend with their husbands as well, but most of them are vending singularly. Now, it's not possible for some of them to go back to the village every day and commute every day from Ranchi, so they prefer staying back just to avoid the travel cost, and also the whole save some time. So for this as well, they don't have any access to night shelters. Now they generally prefer the railway platform, where again they're encountered and kind of they encounter the police and they kind of evict them from that from the platform area, or they are subjected to or prone to harassment. So again, the question of night shelter and safety of women is also missing, and I'm just trying to relate it to street vending particularly, but in general as well. So again, creche facilities are missing, and most of them are carrying their infants also at the same time and simultaneously vending. So especially the fish vendors, if you see, I mean, there's this big drain right behind where they're vending. So generally they tend to make an arrangement for the infant right very close to the drains. So there are also ants, like kind of it's kind of a very disturbing. Sort of an image to look at how the infants are sort of lying very vulnerable, and they also carry this this cloth towel, and where they carry the infant and when they're commuting. So these are some of the scenarios and hardships that they have to simultaneously, care work that they're giving to their children, and they have to simultaneously kind of encounter, because there are no facilities available to them. Also, over 60% of the women's, I've already mentioned this, that they commute every day. Now, just coming to the formation of the Ranchi Mahila Hawkers Union. So this union was formed in 2011 after the prominent and sort of formidable role of women in the in sort of preventing an eviction. In 2010, basically, Jharkhand High Court passed an order to evict all hawkers from the streets. So this was this historic rally that was followed, and the women really came out, I mean, along with men, and there was no separate union particularly per se. They were part of the Ranchi Footpath Dukandar union, and then given the role of union and given the role of women and how they prevented the eviction from taking place, they came together and they formed a separate union called the Ranchi Mahila Hawkers Federation Union, and eventually they were able to kind of prevent more evictions and day-to-day evictions, forced evictions that was happening. One of the cases being Lal Bazaar, very recent case where they around 400 women protested and 400 people protested, vendors protested, and 60% of them being women, and they prevented the eviction happening in that area. The outcome of these women unionizing these women vendors have been that it's not just they are able to kind of claim their spaces, their rights as women vendors, but also there is a level of mutual trust, financial interdependency. There's collective negotiation that they're doing with the government, and alongside also they're able to kind of come together and kind improve the situation, and at the same time they upgrade their market environment. So at the same time, given the context that there is already an act in place for the street vendors, and the implementation has been very poor in Ranchi, and as per the act, there is supposed to be a town vending committee which is supposed to constitute of mostly of the vendors, and they are supposed to do the survey. The survey is still waiting, and at the same time we've seen that how women are pushing and continuously lobbying with the government to do the survey and kind of get their place, get their identity cards, and at the same time get their vending zone notified. Also in 2018 we've seen that how these women union, Ranchi Mahila Women Union played an important role, and they have inspired women vendors across the country, and they came together in 2018 to form the All India Women Hawkers Federation, which is like a national body now under the umbrella of NHF, but it's also making an effort to kind of become an independent body over time, and it has representation of over 15 states with specific prominence in Ranchi, Kolkata, Manipur, and also they've come together and they're continuously lobbying with stakeholders at various levels, specifically government, to raise their demands, specifically in the context of the Street Vendors Act and the implementation of it in different states. Yeah. Okay, these are some of the pictures of. This is one in the, they have their monthly meetings, they have, they collect some amount, and this is how they're making it more sustainable. Also, this is the All India Women Hawkers where they come together, raise their demands. Just to conclude, I mean, yeah, one of the fact that women unions, obviously unionizing women is critical and fundamental, but I'm also trying to raise the question that we need to think beyond unions and association and see how we are able to challenge as women the existing system. And women unions, they how can we make these or how the unions themselves can make them sustainable, in the sense that a lot of union fizzles out or are ad hoc in nature. So how the scope of dialogue or collective bargaining and how they can be trained in this process, because a lot of them are sometimes lost, and they come together, and then the question of sustainability is really important. So that is something that we are also saying, and how they can collectively represent different states and come together as a federation, which is also a culmination of different unions, and how the state should, what should be the role of state in responding or acknowledging and including their participation in the policy making process specifically. And I think Ranchi Mahila Hawkers Union is one such case where the women have been able to come out and claim their spaces, their right to the city, and it's really interesting to see the formation of All India Hawkers Federation also. And as Yuva, we've been able to kind of be there and ensure our support, and how we can empower and engage with them, and also kind of support them in any way possible. And this is like something that's ongoing. So the federation is just formed in 2018. So it's also about sustaining the federation and also training, how we can facilitate. We are exploring in that sense of terms. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mehjibin, and I also represent the organization YUVA, Youth for Unity and Voluntary Action. and I've been working in Guwahati since 2016 with Yuva, and we work closely with the communities there in the informal settlements in different sectors like community intervention. We also do networking with the different organization, like-minded organization, and the government, and also advocacy with the government on the policies, and also we support anti-eviction. So since we have been working in the community so closely, so I'll be speaking on the topic which is burning the state now presently, the citizenship crisis, and also adequate housing shortage in Guwahati. Before starting my presentation, I'll start narrating a story of the community where we have been working. Since the NRC, we know everyone, it is known to everyone that it started in 2015. So how NRC affected the settlers of the informal settlements or the residents of the informal settlements, I'll be speaking on that. So we have seen that most of the residents who have been living in the informal settlements of Guwahati, they have been migrated since decades to the communities there and been settling. Like they have been migrated from Bihar, there have been people from MP, also people from the interstate, we know that in Assam it is also a flood prone area, so there have been people from the villages, the chor areas, who have been coming to the city for various reasons, and they have been settling in the informal settlements. So the story which I am saying is, I'll be narrating, is of a lady who is in her mid-50s, and her parents were migrated from the Bihar in around 6 to 7 decades before. And while what she faced while proving her documents in the NRC was that in 2015, when the NRC started, she had only her voter ID card and the PAN card, which are the only document she had, but the main document which was required was the prior document from 1971 that she had to prove. So she had to give her document of their parents, but she was unaware that her parents registered their vote or not, so she couldn't find that paper of prior to 1971, and she just submitted that in 2017. But and consequently what happened was, in 2018, when the draft list came out, then her name was not included, or her children's name was also not included, because they also couldn't, she had to prove from her father's side, and their children had to prove from her husband or her father's side. So they both couldn't produce their papers, so their names were not included in the draft in 2018. And what happened was, the process of claims and objections started. When we had to file claims, then we had to, what we did was, as Yuva, we supported them, and what we did was, we wrote the case history of what was the when they migrated, what papers she had. And what happened was, in 2016, that community, that Uzan Bazar community, which is located in the middle of the Guwahati, it also a fire incident cracked in that place, and all the documents of the residents, around 100 residents are in the community, and all the papers were burnt. So what they had, only they had a proof of their, means the police report, and they couldn't make their documents also next in 2017 or 18. So while in 2018, when they had to prove their claims, then they didn't have their original voter ID card, or they didn't have their original PAN card or any ration card or any proof. So what we had to do is only to write the case history and to attach the proof of the police report which they had in their hand. So again, when in 2018, this was in the month of July, when they were proving their citizenship, they were running after the NSK centers. They wanted to submit their papers. Again, the NSK centers were not taking their papers because there were no legal document. But after we intervening, then we advocated with the NSK centers, and then we submitted their papers, and then their papers were taken. And consequently, what happened in the month of September, again, what the hurdle they faced was, the whole community, they receives notice from the railways of eviction, because it was established in the railway land, that community, they receives again eviction notice. So in one hand, they were fighting for the citizenship, and again on the other hand, they were also fighting for the house, they were fighting for the place to live in, because their they received eviction notice from the railway department. But to that also we at last we had to file this one. We had to file for a stay, and we had to file a case in the High Court, and but the situation is that they are in stay now. So these are the situations, these are parallel situations which happens in the informal settlements of the Guwahati now they are facing. So I just wanted to set the context, and now I'll go to the history why NRC has been started actually in Assam particularly. It was again a history of conflict over the land. So what happened was, there was from the colonial administration period only, so when the land has been the central issue of the people. So because people were in the identity crisis, people were facing identity crisis, people were facing that their land will be taken away by the migrators. So what the citizens, also what the local residents of the Assam, they wanted was to have a check over the population, or to check over the population ki there are illegal immigrants, or what they say as a term, what they use is there are immigrants or not. To check over that, the NRC process was started in Assam, and as a consequence, this the whole from the 2015 and also previously in 1951 there was actually NPR was in 1951 NPR was done there, but it had no consequences. So again the hesitation started. There was Assam Accord which was signed on 1985 by the groups of different political parties, different organization, local organization, and by the government of India. Then, and in according to the Assam Accord 1985, they decided that NRC will take place in Assam, and they will check upon the population. They will check upon the population, and then it will be checked upon what can be done with that, and to save their land and to save the identity crisis which the residents of the local residents of Assam were facing was because of this the NRC was started. Then migration in Assam is also that if we see the different academicians, intellectual and researchers, they have classified various groups, major groups of migration in Assam. They were the tea planters, tea plantation workers which were brought to Assam in the during the colonial administration of the Britishers, the Bengali Hindus, the Bengali speaking Muslims, the Marwaris, the Adivasis, or the Nepalis, Hindu refugees, etc. All were the from the East Pakistan or from the later Bangladesh, there were the migrators to Assam. Then according to the fellows, that the new population, both the agricultural laborers and administrative staff, was taken over by the local residents. So that was the crisis which the people were facing, and because of that crisis only, that the whole situation or the whole turmoil began to develop. It was the animosity which began between the Bengalis and the Assamese settled in the beginning of the 20th century. It was a report which was published by Mulan, who wrote that the peasantry from the East Bengal were grabbing vacant land of Assam and turning the Assamese into a subordinated minority in their own state. And this was the reason which later on which gave to the which started which gave the process to start. So the question of citizenship and NRC, as I said, that it was again a method to get rid of the dominating nature towards the community, especially the East Bengal origin Muslim communities. From the earlier only there, or the people who are established in the Chor areas, if we see if Bengali speaking Muslim is seen there, or if he is seen with wearing a lungi or a skull, if he is wearing a cap, then he is responded as a Bangladeshi or Bangladeshi. So to avoid that, those people also, they also wanted ki yes, NRC should happen, and yes, we should come out of the tag that we are getting from the means from the earlier days or from the previous days. There was a tag which they were, and they were facing discrimination in every terms, in terms of land. If they come to Guwahati, also if they come to settle in every situation, they are facing discrimination. And to come over the discrimination, they also agreed ki yes, it should happen, and yes, we should also be check our proof our documents, proof our citizenship, and we then only if our names get included, then we will at least come over the instinct, or we will come over the tag that we are labeled every day in every situation. So in 2018, but the situation again, it took a different phase, because when in 2018 the 21 lakhs people's names are not included in NRC, in the draft NRC, then again people had their claims and objection. They submitted their claims. After submitting the claims also, now the administration was the administration was coloring it in a different way. The process was started in a good way, but the administration, they took it in a different way, because in 2018 they also, the Home Ministry in December, after publishing the draft, what they did was, if anyone from anywhere can claim object any people ki they have doubt. There were doubtful voters. The doubtful voters again also have a different history. That was done by the BSF, the Border Security Force. Border Security Force, they take every year, they take the voter list of the they take voter list from every district, and they do what, they check. They had to, actually Border Security Force had to give names to the administration of people entering to the state or not. So what they did was, they randomly marked people, and they marked doubtful citizens, and then they again those people were marked the doubtful voters. They again had to prove this in the foreigners tribunal, and again the case, again they have to prove with the documents and that they were actually Indian citizens. So again in that also happened in 2018 December, was the ministry, they took out papers ki you can anyone can object. I was also not spared from that objection. Anyone, a person whom I don't know also marked me, objected on my citizenship. We had 8 members in my family, but my uncle was marked as doubtful. Then again I had to show my paper, again I had to face hearing, and then my citizenship, then I had to prove my citizenship. So this happened to every Muslims, we say every Muslims, because they lived in the Chor areas. They had to travel 300 to 400 kilometers to prove their hearing. They were called for hearing the one day before, and the second day they had to go for the hearing, and they have to appear for the hearing, and they had to prove with the papers ki yes, they were citizens of India. Secondly, if I come to the urban context of the urbanization process in Assam, is very structurally very new, and it is as it is very new, it is also developing very rapidly. So Assam being an agriculturally prone area and industrially backward state than compared to other different states, we have it is hard to accept, but it is actually reality that we are lacking behind industrialization. We are because Guwahati, or the capital city, is only very new. It was from Shillong, it was separated, and it was a village which is being turned to city now. So the concept of informal settlements is also very new there. The settlements are very old. Settlements are 50 to 60 years old, but now people are they take it very wrongly. It is hard for them to accept that slums are existing in Guwahati. They don't use the word slums, or they don't know about the informal settlement. So again, we have to make consent building of the people. We have to aware the people ki yes, they should should also their rights should be also ensured. The people means from the civil society, they are hardly accepting the informal settlements. They are marking them as illegal, and they are accepting forceful evictions, which we are trying to actually in times in this 3-4 years we are trying to ensure that the civil society also they become aware that their rights should, the informal settlements rights should be also be aware. So most of the informal settlements are established in the railway line, so they face forceful eviction. Also, not only this is just a map, not only the not only the settlements is in the state in the railway lines there, it is also, since it is geographically very different, the state, there are settlements in the hills, and there are settlements in the marshy lands, there are settlements in the wetlands and also in the hills. So those hills people people may not be aware, but in 2017 December, there was massive evictions which took place in Amsang Hill of the means in the central Guwahati. There is a Amsang Hill, and there massive eviction for 3 days continuously. People were being evicted. So what was they were means in the hills the bulldozer that don't go, so people take elephants, people take any means they use, and they evict those people. And when they ask is what actually was the reason of the eviction, they say they are settling in the hills. But after a High Court PIL, it again came after 3-4 days, it was stopped. And when there was when a High Court, when they checked in, then they saw that it is a revenue village. Then how can a revenue village be evicted so brutally? So this is what actually one thing is that the informal settlements are not secured in Guwahati. Again, they are doubly, the people are actually burdened there. The settlements are not the slums, if we say, the informal settlements, if we say, they are not notified only. They don't know the administration. We don't have any department or any slum board or any department where we can actually those people can go and address their grievances. Or we also as workers, when we go to the Guwahati Municipal Corporation, they only don't know who will take up the issue of the informal settlements, who will take the issue of the slums. They only throw us from one bench, we go from one table to another table. Then now recently, when the urban schemes are being implemented, the PMAY is there, then SBM is there, none of the settlements, none of the schemes have been implemented. They are introduced there. The people who have been working in the department, they are saying that we have money, but we don't know how to use it, because if we see the PMAY, the vertical, the in situ slum which speaks of in situ slum redevelopment, if we go to implement that, none of this, they don't have any survey of how many slums actually exist in the city, how many do they have any recognition, do they have any notification, because neither not being notified, not being recognized, they can't implement that in situ slum redevelopment. So they are also lacking the housing shortage. Housing shortage is being lacked in the city. So to conclude, this is I would say that in the Guwahati has a historical evidence. It has a history to the NRC. We know we don't think we don't actually find it necessary that NRC should happen in the other state, but in Assam, it has a historical context. Because of that historical context, actually NRC was accepted by the people of Assam to actually come out of that trauma, to come out of that stigma which the people faces. Actually, NRC was started in Assam, but other than that, we actually don't find it necessary that people should be harassed in the names of papers in different states also. This is what. Thank you.
For a very wide range of papers on what community building means in the face of exclusion and how self-organization takes place, when you're denied rights, when you're denied dignity and opportunity. Thank you all for coming and presenting. This is a really pertinent kind of sociological reflection, especially sitting in January 2020. So thank you all.